So let's have a changing of the guard here and have Jason Dechant come on up here, who's going to present our first tool. And while he's getting set up, let me just give him a very brief introduction. Jason's at the Institute for Defense Analysis, where he leads research teams on a variety of topics, serves as the director of the Synthetic Environment for National Security Estimates, or SENSE program at IDA. SENSE is a computer-facilitated simulation you'll see here that focuses on negotiations and decision-making in order to help prevent conflict in fragile states and manage post-conflict transitions. It's conducted in an imaginary country setting, which I'm sure Jason will tell you about. But what even he might not realize is just how valuable USIP has found SENSE as a training tool. It's been used in training programs with participants from Bosnia, Kosovo, Poland, Montenegro, and Georgia. USIP, often in collaboration with IDA, has used this in a number of settings, used it most recently to train over 130 officials from key Iraqi national security ministries. And in fact, we are now collaborating with IDA to expand the capability of SENSE further to enhance the scenarios to include the challenges that are more directly relevant to what's found in Afghanistan. And just in case anybody's confused here, familiar with the USIP SENSE program and doesn't know it as the Synthetic Environment for National Security Estimates, which is the IDA name, but we have a different label for it within USIP because we found that to be a mouthful. And SENSE at USIP stands for Strategic Economic Needs and Security Exercise. So two different sets of acronyms, but it's the same simulation that Jason is going to be showing us. Jason, I think we're ready for you.
Thanks so much, Sheldon. Sheldon did such a good overview. I think I'm done now, so we can go on to the next presenter. Kidding aside, thanks much for having us to talk a little bit about SENSE, an overview of the program, and to try to introduce you to SENSE as much as possible in a short 20-minute segment. But it is something that USIP, as Sheldon had already expressed, has very successfully engaged with partners, not just in the United States, the interagency right now, but indeed actually around the globe, as I hope to get to in just a moment. In the mid to late 1990s, General Wesley Clark, at that point in time Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, was wrestling with challenges of assisting Bosnian and other parties in implementation of the Dayton Accords. He was looking around at his toolkit of tools he might have to facilitate negotiation, instruction, lessons, etc., that he hoped to convey to all the parties that were participating as far as some of the challenges of post-conflict reconstruction and understanding the types of tough decisions that had to be made. One of the things that he did was he equated the type of tool he was looking for, given that he was kind of wanting for a tool to do these things. He didn't have it in his toolkit at the time. One of the things he was looking for, as he later conveyed, was the equivalent of an F-16 flight simulator for post-conflict environments. That is, the ability to put somebody, in this case a foreign government, in the cockpit, allow them to make the mistakes that they might make in the real world and literally fly their economy or their country into a mountain, with obviously being able to avoid doing that in the real world. And so he looked to a simulation solution. In particular, he came to the Institute for Defense Analyses, my organization, a not-for-profit federally funded research and development corporation that he was familiar with already in terms of IDA's tradition at that point in time in simulated environments in the military context for the most part. But General Clark also knew that IDA had some background in post-conflict reconstruction and subject matter experts to bring to bear. Came to IDA, talked to General Welch, the president of IDA at that point in time, and asked if IDA would be up for the challenge of creating a simulation, an F-16 flight simulator, in his words, for post-conflict environments to assist in that instance with Bosnia, but also for applications around the European theaters he had in mind at that point in time. General Welch, being a can-do, an innovative person himself, immediately signed up for the task, and IDA, in its own internal research and development, launched a very quick turn process by which it assembled a team of experts from various disciplines, modeling, simulation, and various academic disciplines to put together the SENSE simulation, the SENSE program, the software that I'll be talking about for the next several minutes, which is the core of the simulation. It's been modified over the years. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But you will see that the core of the simulation remains the same, and a number of pedagogies and curricula have been wrapped around it depending on its application around the globe. On that point, it's important to note that SENSE, Synthetic Environment for National Security Estimates, as it was originally created, whose acronym has evolved over time, utilizes both the virtual, that is a human-computer interaction, and a live human-to-human simulation, in conjunction with all sorts of background material, as I'll mention now and again a couple of times, that's been modified over the years in order to change it and tailor it for the various audiences. The original audience, of course, being senior foreign government leaders, in that instance, the Tri-Presidency in Bosnia, but others have used it as well. So the core of the simulation was developed by IDA, and IDA retains all rights to it, although it's licensed it to a number of various organizations for applications. However, IDA developed the original curriculum, the original wrapping, the scenario, et cetera, around the simulation. That wrapping and curricula has evolved in recent years, especially as USIP has applied it around the globe for various audiences. The distributed interactive software provides for simulation of a number of different player types, and that player type list is actually expanding. I'll mention that again in just a moment as we talk about the more recent applications of SENSE. The player types that you'll find in a SENSE simulation include the government, both an executive and legislative branch, firms, domestic firms, international actors such as non-governmental organizations, foreign donors, and then banking. We have domestic banks, and as well as a monetary authority that's been developed or added to the simulation more recently. Again, evolving since its inception in the late 90s to even current applications as recent as last week, as you heard from Sheldon. The important part about SENSE, and this was General Clark's vision from the outset and remains true today, is that it's an experiential tool. At no point in time is it attempted to be a predictive analytic tool of sorts. IDA has a wealth of experience in that realm, but was asked not to necessarily apply those for the purpose of this simulation, because the idea is to provide participants with a simulated environment where they are less concerned with its predictive power outside of the simulation. In fact, a joke that we've heard a number of times, especially as we were going overseas with the SENSE simulation, is that participants would want to know what the predictive power of the SENSE simulation. And our retort was always that it's very predictive. It predicts with 100% accuracy. 100% accuracy, that is, for the country of Akrona, the fictitious country, which the SENSE simulation is based upon and the scenario is written on. As far as its original intentions, as I mentioned earlier, General Clark's original interest that has blossomed more recently, is that it was designed as a hands-on instructional tool to assist nations coming out of conflict. That is a tool that went beyond the textbooks, the seminars, et cetera, which existed at that point in time, and provided participants with the experience of learning the lessons real time. The target audience at that time was the mid to senior level foreign participants from public and private sector. I'll mention some of those participants, and you'll see that at least initially we were operating at the president and presidential level and the cabinet and sub-cabinet level in a number of these countries. And its initial focus were Balkan nations. However, the simulation has broadened to applications around the globe. In fact, we found that participants have looked at the SENSE simulation, looked at Akrona, and have seen their own country in that, regardless of whether or not we had any intention of modeling their particular phenomena. The original sponsors believed that simulation was superior to existing training in conveying lessons and experience. This is my earlier comment about General Clark and others looking around in their toolkit and not seeing something that provided this type of function for senior leadership coming out of a post-conflict situation. And the original intent of SENSE then was briefly to provide instruction without textbooks, to demonstrate the importance of working across communities in order to create a shared vision. This was at the forefront of General Clark's mind when he was trying to assist with the implementation of the Dayton Accords, trying to get the Tri-Presidency at the time involved and participating in activities like this in a non-conflictual environment. That is, an environment where they could remove themselves from the events, the day-to-day events and the headlines, and learn about negotiation and the impact of decisions real time in a simulated environment, and to bring together those real-world actors in a non-threatening environment. SENSE, as I've mentioned, though, has expanded over time. I'll go through that in just a moment. Akrona, the country that SENSE is 100% predictive in terms of its application, is a simulated country that, as I stated earlier, Originally was built in a Balkan, or framed in a Balkan context, but has evolved over time to look like a number of various nations, depending on where it's being applied. But the computer simulation is only part of it. And the graphic that you see here depicting a Corona, as basic and crude as it might be, you'll see another screenshot that I've got, and you'll see more in a short video that I'll share with you momentarily. The graphics haven't really evolved beyond the inception in the late 90s, early 2000s. And there was a reason for that. The sponsor had in mind, and similar sponsors early on had in mind, that they wanted to create a simulation tool that served as a database to feed back decisions real time, to see participants see the results of their decision, but they didn't want their participants to get immersed in the tool itself. And we found that to be true in sense applications. That is, that although the participants might be glued to the screens initially, as they become familiar with the simulation, they experience the simulation, they step back from the simulation, and the real learning goes on in the human-to-human interaction, using the results that come out of the simulation and the model to inform and to feed that interaction and the learning that goes on. Combined with the simulation are a series of pedagogical tools. One is the instruction. I'll talk about the playbooks and the instruction in just a moment. Another are after-action reviews. This was an important part of the simulation since its early days, and that is that at the end of every day, there are after-action reviews, so that everybody comes together, although you might be sorted out into your communities, your player types, everybody comes together at the end of the day and is fed back the results in an after-action format that allows them to see the impact of their decisions on all the other player types, to understand how the decisions of a specific firm, made possibly sometimes in isolation, impact the aggregate. And the after-action review permits them to do that. Sense is a technology, a simple wiring diagram. Fortunately, this was created long enough ago that we had to use wires in setting up our network, but wireless technologies permitted us to set up networks wirelessly, which I wish I would have had when I was doing this in the Republic of Georgia in 1999 and 2000. Because the infrastructure was very different at that time, and wireless would have been much easier. But nonetheless, when we were in Georgia, when we were in Bosnia and elsewhere, we set up a network that looked very similar. That is, along the left-hand side, you see depicted the firms that are portrayed in the simulation. Originally, 6 firms were played, and we have the ability to expand as many firms as possible. It's an econometric model, and the focus initially, and still today, is to talk about resource and resource decision-making and the impact that that has on a post-conflict environment and the negotiation that fuels and the decisions that have to be brokered amongst participants. In addition to the firms, you also have a banking sector. Originally just a single bank, now 2 banks and a monetary authority. Monetary policy was overlaid in the simulation more recently. The national government includes an executive branch, which includes a traditional civilian side of the aisle, and then also a Ministry of Defense that was created largely working with the Georgians early on, because they wanted to understand the impacts of resource decision-making in their military establishment. And then a legislature is also simulated in a sense. Along the right-hand side, you see a host of international organizations that the sense simulation also includes. To include your multinational corporation, your international NGO, your local NGOs as well. And yet one example, again, a simple example, but there are hundreds of screens much like it in the sense simulation that provide displays of, and either provide opportunity for inputting data, as this screen does. This is a screen capture from the executive government, for example. If you are in the executive government, if you're one of 5 to 10 participants with various portfolios assigned to your ministry, these are the types of screens that you see, and you have the ability to change the budget on a regular basis and to put resources where you'd like to see them in the simulation. And the simulation, the benefit of the sense simulation, is that those decisions percolate throughout. That is, if you invest money in the health sector, you're going to see health indicators as reflected in the simulation impacted. Likewise, if you take money out, there are similarly adverse effects of that. And so it's a resource decision-making game that allows individuals to make decisions, input them in screens like this, and then hundreds of other screens provide output data. That is graphics, histograms, line graphs, etc., that show where the resources are going, who's doing what, and more importantly, the impacts of those decisions. So if they aren't satisfied with the results of the decisions that they're making in a real-time, regular basis, they can go and work with the other parties in the simulation to come to a negotiated position or a better solution. And these actions recorded in the sense database, or underlying Oracle database that drives the simulation, are recorded, and results are played back real time, with periods or months in the simulation being played out as fast as 3 minutes a month or 6 to 12 minutes a month, depending on how familiar the participant audience is with the simulation. So I've provided a very brief overview. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in a moment in terms of how Sense has been used with various participant groups and how it's evolved in recent years for applications around the globe. But it can sometimes be difficult to get a sense of Sense, so to speak, a feel for the simulation, the dynamic that's created without going through a full seminar or even a half-day demonstration. Obviously don't have the luxury of that, but what I do have is a little bit of footage I'd like to share with you, just a couple of minutes that provides a broad overview of Sense, but more importantly provides some of the Sense experience in terms of the frenetic environment and the types of decision-making skills that Sense intends to convey.
For something over 40 years now, IDA's role has been analysis and supported defense decisions. Simulation has long been an important contributor to this kind of analysis. Now advanced interactive simulation has reached the point where it's making important contributions to insights and understanding of more complex defense decisions. Sense, that is, synthetic environment for national security estimates, extends this interactive simulation, or gaming, if you will, to bring into the process the far more complex set of national security contributors, that is, the economic, the political, and the cultural, along with the military dimension.
We're operating here at a month a minute here. It's like high-speed chess. You just do stuff and you see what happens.
That was one of the things I found very useful in the whole thing. The whole flying by the seat of the pants. The whole, how many of the governments that are in these situations have a screen they can go to and the touch of a finger find out all this information.
The Sense virtual environment evolves over time according to the collective actions of all participants. Sense is more than a game. It is a generalizable gaming architecture. In the post-Cold War geoeconomic and security contexts, it allows complex issues involving economic actors, markets, special agents, and rogue states to be considered collectively for policy-making purposes. Sense affords senior decision makers an improved understanding of the essential need for economic prosperity to promote global military security and political stability. As well, it highlights the critical role that stability and security play in forming a basis for economic growth and rising social welfare. In order to avoid ethnic, cultural, and political distraction, the current version of Sense employs a fictitious nation. This nation, a krona, is endowed with economic, social, and demographic characteristics closely aligned to the experiences of the target audiences. Sense provides a realistic economic experience. Both private and public sectors are modeled. The current version of the game supports 24 economic sectors. All sectors are connected to the international economy. Government has control over taxes, tariffs, and investments by the private sector on a sector-by-sector basis. Participants are provided with instant information about changes in social welfare and economic conditions, including health, education, public order, culture, environment, housing and resettlement, gross domestic product, unemployment, and government budgets.
We're looking at, we don't want to become too dependent on you in these different sectors.
Right.
Because this is a long-term sustainable activity for us.
Defining the conditions for successfully transitioning to a stable, market-based democratic society is the primary goal of Sense. Participants are confronted with realistic problems likely encountered during recovery, reconstruction, and development.
The issue is who should spend that surplus. Should we target it as a government, or should we go ahead and give a tax cut to the people?
We've just provided the government with cash grants.
How should resources provided by donor nations be used to promote a viable economy during the first few years of recovery? As the economy grows, how should internal and donor resources be used collectively to ensure rapid increases in employment, rising wages, and improved social welfare? And in the long run, when the domestic economy is strong enough to generate growth on its own, what sort of development policies would government and industry like to see in place?
I wondered if you might consider a reduction in your tax rates.
National leaders must understand that decisions affecting the long run cannot be postponed. Actions taken today have long-term consequences. While player economic interactions are tracked and facilitated via the computer network provided by the Sense architecture, personal interactions are encouraged as part of the course of play.
Yeah, we do the low interest loan. We'll consider you a partner in our business.
Okay.
And we would have an expectation that you would be our interface with the government.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
The point of Sense is not to predict outcomes. The purpose is to let participants try out various strategies, learn how one player's actions affect all the others in the game, and engage in team building. Player response has been overwhelmingly positive.
I was born in Sarajevo, educated in Bosnia, got my master's degree in Sarajevo in business. I thought it was really, really good. It was very educational, and if the game is going to be played back home, I think people will find it very interesting, and probably first time to see, to have hands-on real market economy.
As a game, it's wonderfully designed and quite interesting, and in many ways very realistic.
I think the simulation's been, for me certainly, a valued learning experience.
Fantastic. Okay, that's a great setup for questions and answers now. So I hope folks are going have been writing them down as they were going along. We see lots and lots of hands here. Well, we'll start right in the front, and then we'll move our way back.
Yeah, it looks like a very... Oh, sure. I'm Pauline Baker from the Fund for Peace. It looks like a very useful tool, but it seems as though there's a hidden premise, and that is the injection of material resources will produce certain impacts. But, of course, there's no way of measuring that. You're measuring outputs rather than outcomes. And second, how do you deal with the non-quantitative variables in post-conflict reconstruction, such as addressing grievances and reconciliation and things like that?
Very good questions, Pauline. There are a number of ways in which the simulation accommodates or addresses some of these issues, in particular on the quantitative or the non-quantitative realm as far as grievances. As I stated at the outset, the Sense simulation itself, the software, is just the core. The real experience of Sense simulation is the human dynamic that's wrapped around it. And the fact of the matter is that every single event, no two events are similar in the fact that they're really based upon the lessons that the participants take away and the dynamic that is created. And so much evolves out of the software, out of the simulation itself, and groups take on their own personality. That is, there are donor conferences, national fora, et cetera, where people will grow an issue that started in the software, but then create their own interaction that takes place. They'll stage their own coups. They'll have their own truth and reconciliation equivalent type of event beyond just the simulation, what's scripted in the playbook and what goes on in the software. I guess I should have stated at the outset that everything in the Sense simulation beyond the initial conditions is free play. That is, whatever happens in the simulation is a function of the player dynamics. And so the player dynamics quickly evolve beyond the software itself, and they grow to deal with these issues. For example, there are things that are scripted, non-quantitative things, non-modeled things that are in the playbook that deal with grievances and such, that they address in various breakout groups and various cohorts. And so they resolve those issues on their own, even if they aren't scripted or modeled formally in the simulation. It's become really interesting how there are things that were never intended originally in the software take on a life of their own well beyond the software, and they address these issues. When the Georgians or the Bosnians were participating, they were bringing their own issues to the simulation, whether or not the software accommodated them. And they were taking care of those things in the context of a Sense simulation outside of the software, in free play, in the human dynamics. As far as resource issues and input versus output, it's an econometric model, and so it is largely resource-driven in terms of types of investments and things. There are things that go into the details of the simulation that we can talk about sometime that have been added to the simulation over the years to demonstrate that there are areas, especially in a post-conflict environment, where you can invest more money and there's a point of diminishing returns, that you may not see what you would expect by investing more dollars in a particular area of investment. And so those types of things have been put in the simulation to try to make sure that participants are not left with the impression that spending more money in the simulation will achieve the objectives they desire.
We'll take one more in this quadrant, and then Joanna will take one back there.
Hi, I'm Bill Stubner from the Lewis Berger Group. I guess I want to ask, what kind of assumptions do you make about the players and about actual policymakers? Because since, for example, since this was developed for Bosnia originally, I'll just very quickly repeat a joke that many people here have heard from a pre-war joke where old Hassan is out plowing his field and he hits something and he pulls it out and wipes the dirt off, and it's a lamp and a genie pops out. And the genie thanks him for releasing him from his imprisonment and said, for that you get one wish. And he said, wait a minute, do I get 3 wishes? He said, this is Tito's Yugoslavia. You're lucky you get 1. But he said, but I've got to warn you before you make your wish. Whatever you wish for, your Croat and Serb neighbor are going to get twice as much. And so, that puts him in a real quandary. And then old Hassan gets a smile on his unshaven face, and he says, I know what I want. Put out one of my eyes. So, given those kinds of real dynamics in the political world, are you able to go back to a place like Bosnia where you got your start and say that this simulation has had any kind of positive effects? Frankly, some of the players, if they're as nefarious as some of them are, might even look and say, well, I don't really want stability and the development of democracy, so this is what would bring that. I've learned that from the game, so this is what I want to do to try to counter that.
Well, in terms of metrics and going back and evaluating certain countries after they've gone through a simulation, the way that the program has evolved over the years, unfortunately, hasn't had a way to formally go back and evaluate, except in a couple of long-term instances where USIP has successfully employed it. For example, you heard at the outset, and I'll mention again, that USIP conducts sense simulations on a monthly basis in Baghdad, for example. The University of Warsaw and their equivalent to National Defense University in Poland has institutionalized sense over the last several years and has used it with a number of NATO aspirants. But in the early days, whether it was Bosnia or Georgia, we haven't formally gone back and reviewed or done some sort of assessment to see what types of impacts it had. Other than anecdotal, for example, we're conveyed by the Georgian audience and participants that a majority of those who came into power with the Rose Revolution were alumnus of the SENSE program. I'm not suggesting any formal contact between the two of them, obviously, but the fact that they were trained and learned some basic tenets of market democracy, transition, post-conflict reconstruction in a SENSE simulation could have had some impact, or more importantly, possibly the networks that were created when we went over and conducted a SENSE simulation and the cohorts that evolved out of that. In terms of assumptions, the model is pretty transparent for those who spend a lot of time with it. It is an econometric model. It's based on Western economic principles that are built into the algorithms, which for the purposes of peer review were made early on available to the academic community and went through a number of peer reviews. Given those assumptions, I've been surprised, I guess I should say, with how successfully it's been applied to a number of different countries and a number of different participant audiences. Give it a life of its own. That is, if certain audiences have a heritage of corruption or merely dealing differently in economic situations, they bring that to the simulation and they see how it plays out. They find that workarounds, but in the end, and I would say this almost without fail, that they realize that these workarounds and the various ways that things operate, that it's better to go back to kind of the model or the simulation, and they realize, and that's one of the major teaching points, always has been of SENSE, is that coming together and working together towards a shared vision will ultimately lead to some measure of progress, whether that is economic growth, which is a measure in some audiences, or maybe it's social indicators. We found participants who have been more interested in that than in economic growth per se.
Where say X percentage of resources are going to waste within the actual society, therefore the outcome's a lot less than there should be?
We do in the current model, and as I think you heard Sheldon allude to at the outset, we're actually modifying the model to better emulate conditions in Afghanistan, where we do better account for those things. The current model does have a couple of hooks that account for corruption and things of that sort. For example, investment in police and law enforcement has a point of diminishing returns if there's too much investment beyond a certain point. And there are other things that grow out of the simulation where there are transactions that go on the side where people transfer funds almost illegally in order to facilitate corrupt activities. At one point in time, in some of the early applications with domestic audiences, we had a stability index in the model that didn't really feed back into the model in terms of impact on the country, but was an interesting foil for participants to see how their country was evolving according to a stability index that we proposed. And they were reacting to that. That is, they would see stability going up or down in their society. It was perfectly transparent, at least in our model, what that was a function of, and they would go back and try to correct for those things in order to develop a more stable society.
Another question. And Ben, thank you for keeping that question brief and to the point.
Hi, my name's Julia Loughran. I'm from ThoughtLink, and I'm formerly from IDA, so raw team, do the handshake. Can you just give us some nuts and bolts about Sense? How long does it take to run? How many facilitators are needed? The computing power?
Yeah.
What's the average size of the training organization? What kind of pre-training? That kind of information.
Sure, I'd be happy to, and I'll keep it very brief. I'll just flash this size up. The participant group is typically a group of about 40 to 80. It can accommodate that many people, and sometimes even more, as far as the participant audience. The trainers, it can take typically between 15 and 20, depending on how you're equipping it. And those trainers involved actual, what we call tutor coaches, people who are training the trainers, essentially, because all the knowledge about the simulation is conveyed by these trainers. So you have trainers who stand behind the participants, provide the instruction, and then usually another cadre of anywhere between 4 and 6 senior mentors, depending on what kind of pedagogy you want to wrap around the simulation and what kind of seminars and teaching points you'd like to convey. That'll drive how many senior mentors you have. You also have the Playbook, which is the scripted playbook with roles assigned to the participants, and that's dozens of pages long with a one-page role for each of the participants coming into the simulation. That's off the shelf. If you need to customize a scenario, then that's another issue. You would have to start from scratch and customize a scenario if you want to change the conditions significantly. So again, a participant group of 40 to 80, about 15 to 20 staff. It's not a one-day event. It's typically done at a minimum a 2.5 to 3 day event. When we were doing this with Bosnia and Georgia, we were actually doing 5-day events, and the reason for that is we were putting a lot of seminars and teaching points beyond just the simulation into that 5 days. But it can be done between 2.5 days to 5-day event. And the underlying kind of guts, the technical guts of the simulation is it can be run on laptops. It's a SQL server, an Oracle server, written in SQL with a Power Builder front end for people who do modeling.
And when you run this, do you bring the equipment, or do you?
We typically bring the equipment. I'll tell you, in some of these places early on, we had to rent the equipment there. In Bosnia, they had facilities that they were able to provide us with the equipment. Now we deploy with laptops, and that's become much easier than, again, deploying to Bosnia or Georgia in the late 90s.
Okay, great. Last one from the back there.
Abdul Ahmed, computational science and Arizona State University. My question is, one thing that happens always with post-conflict simulation is that the paradigm for which you have designed your model changes by the time you start doing the model. And so do you have any way, any means by which you have empirically grounded your simulation model? And can you also describe what does your model involve in terms of the scale, spatial and temporal? You described the Bosnia, for example. There was entirely different ethnic situation in Mostar. There was different situation in Sarajevo. And so what's the scale? And third and the last one is, in terms of information, you said if a user changes a variable, he could see other changes. Does that mean that you are using a certain economic or political, socio-economic equation that has direct causal effect that can directly show? Or is this a complex system whereby different rational agents can choose things and you cannot trace back the outcome to an individual cause?
Trying to address those questions in order. The first, in terms of the empirical basis for the model, again, it's an econometric model with underlying algorithms that were initially reviewed. They're basic principles that are from a variety of sources that we could go into some detail offline about, of course. We've never spent the time to go back and take a game, for example, and empirically validate it using a game and going back and adjusting the model, so to speak. I guess the validation in the model has come, again, as a training tool, has come with over 10 years of applying it to various environments and had participants tell us that it was an accurate reflection, how they saw the interactions occur, where it was an accurate reflection of what they saw in the real world, and it was a reasonable enough environment for them, which is all we're asking in terms of a training simulation, a synthetic environment that we're immersing them into. And so there's that form of validation. We found out, although, as I've already discussed, it grew out of a Balkan heritage and it's been applied around the globe, found out from the event last week that there was a former principal at the UN High Commission on Refugees who felt that the simulation accurately emulated conditions that he had seen in Mozambique, for example. And so we get feedback on that like that routinely about the simulation. So that's one form of validation, is that it meets the participants' criteria. In terms of the scalability, which I think is an integral issue, it was started out, the simulation and the Corona is a single entity. That is, it's a federal system, single entity, without regions per se. Although there are ways in assignment of roles and such, we do break out people into regions, we do break out people into ethnicities. There is ethnic interplay built into the scripting of the simulation. The software itself is a single region, a federal system with a parliament in place. In terms of the temporal scaling of it, it goes on literally, a game typically goes from about 6 to 12 years out. That is, from the start of the game, starting point, you go, again, 6 to 12 years out, moving the marker, moving the period anywhere between 3 to 6 minutes of the game. Usually starting out slower so that people can get accustomed to the simulation, and then speeding it up as they become more accustomed to the simulation. So temporally, it goes out 6 to 12 years. Spatially, it's a geographic region, a single region. The Afghan model that we're developing, or the changes we're making to current sense to better emulate Afghanistan, is going to have a regional component to it. It will have distinct regions operating.
Okay, excellent. We're going to go to the online community for our last question for Jason here. What are you hearing online, Joel?
Lots of interesting parallel conversation, especially around this dynamic of how much technology and immersion is the right amount, and balancing that human-to-human interaction, and also how to measure success. A lot of interest online on that. But I'll pass on one question about the application in different regions from Fatima Okal, looking at Sense Video and wondering how many African leaders have had a chance to participate, if you can talk about application to different environments. And the other reason it was interesting is I couldn't figure out where Fatima's from, because it's actually coming from the Twitter account of a Second Life avatar, which actually blows even my mind on the technology.
You don't know if this guy even really exists.
Exactly. So from virtual to virtual.
Well, it's good to see that there's some parallel in the discussion, and there has been rich discussion. On the issue of African participation, this hasn't been done in an African country. There have been African participants here and there throughout the games that we've held over the years, but it's never had an African country as a target audience. That said, both recently and in the distant past, we've gone down the path of planning it for application in an African country. Had a couple of prospective targets, had some interested sponsors, had some countries who were interested in the training. So we'd thought through to a fair degree how we would go about applying it, but haven't yet applied it to an African context.
Thank you, Jason, very, very much.